We are in a transition from one pandemic to another. A transition to a new pandemic. We are in a position of great uncertainty with respect to variants. But what we know is alarming. Decisions to reopen do not come with guarantees, except that cases of COVID-19 will rise when we interact again more frequently.
Charlie Brown, oh Charlie Brown. It's time I'm gonna kick that football clear to the moon. Isn't it peculiar, Charlie Brown, how some traditions just slowly fade away?
I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington. Coming up at the top of the hour, the Pentagon investigates a report that U.S. soldiers refused to go on a dangerous mission in Iraq. We'll have details. In medical news, the FDA prescribes a strongly worded label on antidepressant drugs. And why some experts think the flu vaccine shortage is a grim warning about U.S. vulnerability to bioterrorism. All those stories, much more, only minutes away on Wolf Blitzer Reports. Now back to Crossfire.
When you hear that some people have died immediately after or shortly after getting the vaccine, then people immediately jump to that conclusion, maybe that the reporter is trying to tell them that, oh, well, it must have been the vaccine that killed them. But actually, that's usually not the case. We have to remember that, for example, in Ontario, people who are living in our long-term care homes are in the last few years of their life. And that often about 1 in 3 people living in a long-term care home dies every year, just naturally. And so I think the key is that, yes, there are going to be people who might die within days, but that might have just been because they were close towards the end of their life. It wasn't hastened by the vaccine.
That's not how you do knowledge, right? You can't do it backwards. You don't start with what you want to be true, then write a bunch of bull crap, and then send it off. And idea laundering is where you start with something like opinion or prejudice, and you write down a scholarly looking paper that looks very authoritative, and then you get it published as scholarship that the academy verifies. It gets used to set educational curricula and gets taught as truth, as fact.
So the kids are going back to school, but the downfall is that every time they reopen the schools, they add new measures. And the one measure they have added is they're going to do asymptomatic PCR testing on the students. And one of the biggest problems with that is, other than we know that it's obviously a fraudulent test, when you test in an asymptomatic or, where there's no viral, no COVID, when you test in a population with very, very low incidence of COVID, you are, considerably more likely to get false positives. And that creates fear and panic, and then kids get sent home and schools get closed, and it has a whole lot of ramifications attached to it that nobody's really thinking about when they're putting this into place, that are going to be more detrimental to the children than just staying home and not going to school. So there's really no research being done there.
If I can pipe in for a second, Ted, on that point, I noticed that too. We'll be including that in our school challenge. The mandatory testing is also unconstitutional unless you're informed and consent to it. My experts tell me that we've hired for this challenge is that, and it goes without saying, like every other COVID measure we've seen, has never before in the history of science or medicine been heard of, or used, or tested. So self-isolation, lockdown, it's just never been used. The notion of an asymptomatic disease, my expert tells me, is hogwash. Mm-hmm. It's a notion that's just got invented during the last 9 months. If you're sick, there's going to be symptoms. You can't be sick without symptoms, especially with a respiratory viral infection. Sure, you can be a carrier of a certain disorder and not be sick, but not a respiratory one. You're going to have symptoms. And before I turn it back to you to wrap up, Ted, I just wanted to say as well that people should understand where constitutionally the right to education sits in this country. The right to education is a statutory right up until high school. Free education is a statutory right under the Education Act, first of all. And that education must be dispensed with the terms of the Human Rights Code, which includes equality of treatment. Education in Canada by the courts has also been interpreted by way of that right to education through the International Convention of the Rights of the Child as a Section 7 charter right. Your children have a Section 7 charter right to free education up to high school in accordance with the equality provisions of Section 15 of the Charter, to be accommodated without discrimination on various grounds. So people should understand that, and that the school boards and the school unions and all these vested interests and these fiefdoms, from superintendents to school boards, are not God. And they can't appropriate and misappropriate public funds like this to their own interests and ignore the law under which they act and the Constitution that binds the legislature and everybody else.
Do you and I, as responsible adults, have the freedom and the human dignity to determine for ourselves what is true, what is false, what is good information, what is misinformation, what is hateful, what is not hateful, what is right, what is wrong? Do we not have, in a free society, you're an adult, you get to decide that. In a repressive regime or totalitarian state, the government decides on your behalf, for your own good, of course, to protect you from really bad ideas, to protect you from misinformation. So, it's always a good pretext. We have to save the people from misinformation, or we have to save the people from hurt feelings or from hatred. And this is where Canada's federal government is going.
Again, I don't know how to explain that to people who don't fundamentally understand it. If you don't understand how important what is happening right now is, I would say you probably never will. The
really big issue is, do people understand freedom? Do they love freedom? Do they cherish freedom? Do they actually want to live in a free society? Freedom exists ultimately in the human heart, the human mind, the human spirit.